So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So welcome to the Global Network webinars. My name is Alexander Loschke and I will be moderating this webinar together with my colleagues Sean Lovell and Ronald Janssen. We are happy to have with us today Gianfranco Cecconi from Capgemini Invent, who will be talking about unleashing data sharing. Gianfranco will give us insights of the 20 years of experience of the European Union in this area, and will also give us a glimpse of what will come in the future. The European Union has been committed to unleash the value of data for its citizens and businesses since the original Public Sector Information Directive of 2003. The EU has been supporting the development of data sharing in and among its member states. Starting from government-owned open data, the EU has evolved and shifted focus to data sharing in general with a European strategy for data from 2020. Gianfranco's talk will present the spectrum of actions that the EU has undertaken to implement and support its policy through data.europa.eu, which is about government open data, and the Support Center for Data Sharing, which is about data sharing in general. He will share learnings from those experiences and will offer a glimpse of the data space model for data sharing that characterizes all upcoming EU data policy investments, starting from the ongoing Digital Europe program. So let me now present our speaker. Gianfranco leads globally the collaborative data ecosystems offering for Capgemini Invent. He advises clients and colleagues internationally on the wide spectrum of topics that relate to data sharing, from best practices to legal frameworks and technology, including their practical applications across public and private sectors. In his role, Gianfranco has led several of Capgemini Invent's flagship open data and data sharing projects, such as the European Union's Open Data Program, programs which I have mentioned before. Gianfranco is a proud alumnus of the Open Data Institute, where he served as a data scientist and consultant. He volunteers for working groups in the International Data Spaces Association and the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. So now, before I hand over to Ronald, who will also say a few words, let me quickly mention some practical things. So as usual, we will first hear the presentation of our speaker, Gianfranco, and we'll then have a Q&A session at the end. Please feel free to write comments and questions into the meeting chat at any time. During the Q&A session, you can raise your hand, and then we will give you the floor and you can ask the question yourself. This would be nice because it makes things a little bit more lively. If you're a little bit shy and you don't want to ask the question yourself, no problem, just write it into the meeting chat and we will read it out for you. As always, this Global Network webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Global Network of Data Officers and Statisticians at yammer.com/unstats. And we invite you to continue the discussions on the Global Network after the webinar. So now I will hand over to Ronald Janssen. Ronald, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alex. So I'm Ronald Janssen. I'm with the United Nations Statistics Division in New York. We, as a statistics division, support the community of official statistics. So basically we support all national statistical offices around the world. And specifically, I'm heading a team on data innovation and capacity management. I'm very happy that Gianfranco is here today. And as you see from the title, it's about unleashing data, or actually it's unleashing, I would say, the value of data that we have. And Alex mentioned data.europa.eu. Really can invite everyone to have a look at that. And the amount of data that is at the European level on open government data that is made available is astonishing. So I think there are about 1.4 million data sets out there at national level and at international level within the EU. Now, this global network is a network of data officers and statisticians. The part of the statisticians are in a sense a relatively smaller community, so the community of official statistics, which has been trying to see how we can make better use of the wealth of data which has been out there due to digitalization and so forth. So since a number of years, the community has been wanted to look more closely and is looking more closely at how to use big data and data science. We've been experimenting with a number of task teams on like use of mobile phone data, Earth observations, AIS, this is visual tracking data, some global data sets. Also be looking how like retail scanner data and web scraping for prices can be better used. So we're very, let's say, specific on the kind of data sets that we're looking at. We currently also have a task team that looks at facilitating access to privately held data. They have a bit of an economics perspective. So they currently look more at specific industries and see how they can get additional data from private sector and others who are in that space. So we're specifically looking, just for information, at 5 areas. So one is the flower industry, very specific, semiconductors, retail, e-commerce, and tourism. So within those areas, we try to see if we can unleash more data for global value chains and other kind of analysis. A final word here, what we do within our community is the privacy enhancing techniques. And the whole idea there is how to, again, be able to use the value of data, value of sensitive data by secure data sharing. So how can you enable the sharing of data within government, across government, with private sector, and even also across countries, how data could be shared more effectively, like for instance in the health sector, right? But now I would really like to turn to Gianfranco. I think his perspective is, I mean, from my perspective, very unique in how to unleash the value of data. I know Gianfranco likes to provoke, and I will really give him the floor now to tell us all about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronald, and thank you, Alexander. Let me put my presentation on screen to support the discussion today. Alexander was already very, very generous in introducing me, so I won't need to tell you again about me, and I will go straight into content. I have plenty for you, and it is integral to, let's say, the ethos of my work to share what I've learned over these many years. I've been working in open data and data sharing since 2013. And as an Italian, I could talk for a very long time, I promise. I will try to stick to the timing. I'm checking my watch in front of me. And in some bits of this, I will have to go fast, but I will also be able to share the presentation at the end of this, and you will be able to find me on Yammer and so on. Let's start from the main message of all of this, that possibly is not even mine, but it's a message from the European Commission. That is, perhaps in my wording in this case, that is, data does not need protection, data needs unleashing. It's very obvious to say that we need to protect privacy of people and the intellectual property of organizations and so on. But in the end, what we are saying is that we want to make the best use of the data within the limits put on us by being respectful of people and be respectful of companies and intellectual property and everything else. We may perhaps in our work every day forget that kind of connection. There is so much that can be done thanks to the data we process, we manage, we store, and so on. And the point is not keeping it safe in a drawer. The point is putting it to use and respecting the people and the organizations involved. Today, I will take you through 5 points, and again, checking time. The first one is just to remind you how deep the roots of Europe's commitment to supporting development through data are. I will tell you about 2 of the main initiatives that in practice implemented that commitment, the projects that Alexander named earlier, the European Data Portal, now data.europa.eu, and the Support Center for Data Sharing. I will give you an idea of what's coming next for the next 3 years, the next project on this line of thinking, supporting data sharing in Europe. And I will, hopefully with time, drop to you 4 challenges that I hope you will be helping me solving over the next few years in your role as data officers and statisticians. But let's start. So the roots of the European commitment. Oh, by the way, I didn't tell you why all of these lions everywhere. The point is the point. It's the one I made earlier. I would like you to feel confident in a way as lions. You know your environment, you know the savannah, you know what you can do, you know how fast you run, you know how well you hunt with your peers. You're not necessarily the strongest of animals, you're not necessarily the smartest of animals, but you're great collaborators. And the idea here is to try to revive that spirit. And I use continuously images of lion in my presentation because of that. There's even a lion with a leg at the back. I'm sure you will be with me in using this, say, iconography as we keep going. So perhaps European Union does not use the lion as an image, but the idea is about the same. Look at how many pieces of legislation they've been working on over the almost 20 years from now. This is not trivial. This is not trivial. This was a lot of work for them and for the civil servants in the countries often called to implement this in more detail in the specific legal framework of the specific countries. Since 2003, 4 or 5 different pieces of legislation being currently in consultation or being written, the spectrum of legislation enabling open data and data sharing is significant. And actions like data.europa.eu and the Support Center for Data Sharing, that I will tell you more in a second, bring this to life in the practical space. I will take you through those 2 projects first, just to, in a way, remind you what legislation looks like when your government, your institutions needs to make it happen in the practical terms of everyday behavior, whether it is in government or in the private space. And let's start from the first one, the European Data Portal. 3 pieces of legislation of that spectrum I showed you earlier are the ones that are relative to public sector information. That is the old-fashioned name for government open data. The PSI, Public Sector Information Directives, 3 of them, not even 1, over the years raised the bar every time, pushing the member states in Europe to do more and better in this space. And what was needed to make this piece of legislation in the very early days of 2003 to become something real, they needed a European data portal. But the name is a bit of a misleading, it's a bit of a trick there, because it's not just the portal, it's a combination of several services that we'll touch on very briefly. Again, don't worry to take notes because I will give you the slides at the end. But you see them on screen now, and each of those interact nicely with the other. You may tell the story in different ways, but stay with me. It is actually a program, I would say, for the promotion of open data. It's not really a portal only. The catalog is necessary. In the early days, or when you launch an open data program to promote the open data owned by governments, inevitably, you need to go somewhere. You need to go somewhere on the web. And in 2003, well, when this started was a few years later, many countries did not have their own portals. Many ministries, many agencies of government were a bit not yet ready. And what you would expect from an international institutions like the European Union is to actually give the good example, in a way leading by example. This was one of the earliest portals to use, for example, significant semantic web technologies, when the others would have probably gone for simpler things, or a Spark query engine for the pros among us. All of this is still there for you to use. Differently than other portals that you may have used, this translates the metadata in all the languages of the European Union. So you can search for something relevant to you and find it in another language, which is a bit difficult then becomes, but still quite significant as an effort. And all of this is open source, by the way. So starting point, a data portal that becomes the center, the fulcrum where the community of open data comes to you. Support to the data providers then incentivize the convergence towards standards and interoperability. I wish you disagree with me, but unfortunately you will probably not disagree. That is, there is no consolidated standard for distributing metadata, to bringing together different sources and make data sets very easily discoverable. That was another significant effort that Europe made since the early days. They created a catalog profile. You may know the DCAT standard. They created an application profile of DCAT specific for the European portals. As the countries caught up to the 170 different sources we have today, this standard brought together the portals in publishing metadata in the same way. And we needed that kind of support that we provide to data providers, because they would not have done it otherwise. If we did not give ad hoc support, they would not have, let's say, converged on one. And then you need to demonstrate that this is useful. You need to demonstrate that there is an end game, and that's another thing Europe did. The report you see to the right, the economic impact of open data, is the latest of a series in which, say, secondary research was done to demonstrate to the data providers, the member states mostly, that this was worth doing, that there was a positive impact on the economy, employment, lives saved potentially if you go a bit wild on the projections, and you collect use cases by which the open data is demonstrated at work and provides those benefits. This builds the business case. This report is often used in the member states, and besides, many of you may actually be in one of those member states, to go and knock for more budget to your politicians, because it shows that there is an actual outcome from these operations. And after you made the business case, you also report back. That's another thing that Europe decided to do through us. Every year, we document the state of progress of the various member states in respect to 4 dimensions of technology, policymaking, impact, and the quality of the data and metadata being distributed. This report is also incredibly useful to all of us, because not only it documents progress from last year, but also becomes a reference for the others. You may see what Austria did great last year. You may see, or you may share if you had difficulty, why it happened or what you did wrong. This report collects all of that learning. Education is critical. You probably won't disagree with me on the fact that for many of us, the lack of talent or the lack of opportunities for upskilling our colleagues is, unfortunately, a showstopper. And being in civil service, you're usually among the top of the victims of lack of budget enabling you. So again, another thing the Commission decided to do was to offer e-learning materials, and also we collect e-learnings from the member states when they are developed as well under an open license. This perhaps is obvious. I will not stop too much on this, but the element of dissemination is integral. Many of our citizens out there don't even know what we mean by open data. They don't understand that it can be reused. It's not just about accountability, perhaps in politics. It's also about enabling new business. Again, all of this is not something, unfortunately, most of us will learn at school. So the dissemination channel needs to integrate what we can learn about open data, and being part of social media, covering news, describing open data is an element by which we can achieve that. Now, I'm running a lot, I realize. I'm not seeing the chat, so I hope you're not shouting at me, go slower. Again, I hope I will have time at the end so to get back to you. But all of this so far only covered a relatively easy part of the spectrum of all of data sharing. That is when governments open up their crates of data. What happens when we believe that, like the European Union does, that a lot of value for citizens is also in helping private organizations to share data between them more, or even, of course, with government. And so a new set of documents and regulations and strategies. The General Data Protection Regulation in 2016, probably it's something you all know. You may like it or you may hate it, but it contributed so much to start the very long process by which legislation in Europe, that, as you can imagine, is relatively old in style, to be adapted and integrated to managing digital stuff, digital assets like data. Not trivial. It doesn't work like property or physical objects. You needed a different piece of regulation. GDPR was also relatively accessible. I don't know if you ever had the opportunity to read it. I did it for a charity I was helping at the time. It's something without a background in law, I could read myself. It changed the vocabulary that we are using. It created a shared set of terms we all use to refer, for example, to data processors or about consent, all of those elements. Followed a few years later by the General European Strategy for Data, that more recently is transforming in a whole series of regulations that I will get back on to later, from the Data Governance Regulation just approved by Parliament, Digital Market Data Acts. But how do you support, as a government institution, private sector organizations sharing more data? You do it like this. So similar, let's say, diagram to the one before, but actually with different ingredients here. Data sharing is, of course, more complicated. There is sensitive data in it, most often. There is no book you can buy off the shelf. Say there's no Harvard Business Review book about data sharing. Nobody knows how to do it in a way that is absolutely uncontroversial or unarguable. So the very first thing that the Commission had to do is to explore what is already feasible by observing the market. They collected practice examples. So how is data sharing already happening in the world in effective ways? So to enable you and the other users to pick and choose, let's say, the legal terms, the technical elements, the business models that worked in a way that are suitable to you. We collected real world stories. We interviewed the people actually delivering those businesses or models, and we ran live webinar to try to engage the community and make questions to the people who were the protagonists of these stories. Legal guidance will not surprise you. So publishing open data that is usually not sensitive, not about individuals, very easy. Sharing data between companies, very tricky. How do you do that? Is there a standard contract I could use? Are there legal practices I can rely upon? Well, there were not that many a few years ago. There are now. Although this is very early work, we were asked with our legal partners to work on standard legal terms and arrangements that make a legal framework within which you can move with some degree of comfort. We created recommended contract terms for some industries specifically that are a bit more hot than others. And of course, we also described how legislative frameworks can differ substantially depending on where you are. Sometimes it's called data travel. So if you move data from one country to another, you can actually break the legislative framework you started from and create implications you did not want. We also created a tool for generating licenses, something you start from. So all of this, in theory, hopefully will have made people a bit more comfortable to give it a try. And if legal was not a problem, raise your hand if you think legal is not a problem, technology can still be. Even in private organizations, data skills are very expensive. Small businesses, startups may have significant friction to start, even just because they cannot imagine the technology providing data sharing services. And again, the Commission through us created guidance. This is an interesting one. So there's also a need of an upstream channel, I call it, to support the community of practice. Remember the point I made earlier. Nobody has the ultimate book on data sharing. Integral part of the Commission mission was to learn from the community itself of what was needed, from the simple, perhaps even silly questions in the FAQ to more ad hoc and confidential support channels that they opened through us. And again, the dissemination point that I will not move through that is very, very similar to the one on open data. There's one point perhaps that is interesting to make here that, at least my personal opinion is that literacy enables entrepreneurship more than technical prowess. So we're used to imagine the big tech entrepreneurs as ex-techie, not necessarily. In data sharing, conceiving the business model for good data sharing may be more than enough, and then you find your technical talent you need to implement it. Cool. Taking a second just to breathe here. I believe you're doing well with time, and here it gets a bit more interesting and complicated. So take 10 seconds for digesting everything I shared so far, and let's go and look into the future. So we're not arrived. We are far from being arrived anywhere. We know a bit more how to deal with personal data. We have boundaries. We have strategies, but so much more needs to be done in terms of data governance, advanced data sharing. That will be part of the Data Act. I was actually talking to Parliament this morning. Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, the implication of the markets with respect to data, the implication of non-digital market with the data associated to it, the role of the big distributors and so on. All of this is coming regulated by at least 4 pieces of legislation, one of which is the Data Governance Act should be out next year and perhaps implemented in usually between 12 and 18 months, but everything else is in the pipeline in Parliament to be written and under consultation. But the key element here, and please do not read, keep it for your reference later, the key element that changes the past to the future in the eyes of the European Union legislator is the concept of a data space. We are stopping calling them data sharing in general, because we are finally pushing to a place where we implement the notorious data semantic interoperability that the ones of us coming from academia wished all along. A world made of good quality metadata and open interfaces that enable any participants to interact directly with the other, supported by semantic technologies. So the ones of you who study semantic technology will be comfortable with that. This is nothing new, but the idea of the data space that is at the say the base of all of the legislations coming is that we're getting away progressively, slowly, organically, away from a place where we need a centralized platform of some sort, and we move to a space where organizations and individuals will be autonomous in sharing their data directly with anybody else potentially, without the need of a central, omnipotent intermediator doing the job for you. I will tell you more as we speak. So this is what today most data sharing looks like. Left to the right, relatively self-isolated, industry-focused systems that share data between them, say organizations in health or organizations in energy, with the support of a shared data platform, most commonly called a data exchange, one or more, usually owned by private organizations, each of them with their own systems, each of them with their own cloud arrangements, and so on. When we are lucky, these spaces talk to each other with ad hoc integrations of some sort, that kind of dotted line there. This is the old-fashioned way of doing things. By the way, we may actually be lucky enough when we have something like that. Unfortunately, it's not always like that. Where we want to go next is made of 2 stages from a European perspective. And by the way, what I will show you is my interpretation of this, the way I tell the story. The first step is this. So Europe is running 2 projects very soon. One is called Data Spaces Support Center. That is the successor to the one I told you about before, the Support Center for Data Sharing. And the second one is Simple, without the E, Simple. Simple will be a shared platform for all EU-funded data spaces at the service of private sector. So over the next 3-4 years, I believe 100 and I always forgot the number. It's about 150 million euro are going to fund industry-specific, sector-specific data spaces, because Europe wants this to happen and wants the experimentation to develop the knowledge that is missing to be able to share between industries. And to further help this, they are going to create this shared platform at the bottom called Simple. If you see underneath, there's an element of sovereign cloud. So there are infrastructure in the cloud that is recognized and validated by the European Union as sovereign, which means that we won't have, let's say, in practical terms, we won't have trouble in applying EU legislative frameworks because the data is stored in our jurisdiction and the cloud providers are recognized as such. So the first step is by asking all of these data spaces funded by the EU to be hosted as much as possible on a shared infrastructure, not still a platform. So we are still not getting rid of platform here. We will have a stricter and easier, this is the ambition, integration of the data spaces so that energy can talk to health, can talk to manufacturing, can talk to agriculture. And this is already happening now. Simple, the requirements have been announced like a few weeks ago. Data Space Support Center, the procurement process is finished, and the project will likely start in September or October. Those little symbols you see to the right, the sphere, the pyramid, and so on, those are shared services that will be provided to each of the data spaces. Each of them logically still independent of each other, but strictly integrated because they will use the same standards, the same arrangements, and the Data Spaces Support Center will be required to specify those standards. But this is actually the future. So a few years from now, you see the platform disappears. This is the actual data space that the European Union aspires to get to. Simple, the European Union owned services for data sharing, remain as a provider of services, not necessarily as a platform, because by that point in time, if everything goes according to plan, the individual data spaces will be able to talk to each other directly with those semantic technology I told you about earlier. Data Spaces Support Center will still remain for coordination. And you see to the left that getting rid of the platform, getting rid of the centralization of the design will also allow third-party service providers to start entering this game. For example, for identity services, when you need to identify yourself to a data space, you won't necessarily need to use Simple. You can use whatever third-party service provider, as long as they are interoperable with the others. So, because it gets more complicated, the Commission needed more support. And that is what the Data Space Support Center does. You see, it's an extension of the Support Center for Data Sharing that adds the research around business model, around the building blocks that are necessary in terms of legal and technology and processes, so that these building blocks can be reused and learned from the experience of the others. The Data Space Support Center will be responsible to set standards for everybody so they can be interoperable. There will be significant effort to build a community of practice, because this is exploding in size, by the way. It's not just complexity. In a way, what the Data Space Support Center did until now, the Support Center for Data Sharing, the old project, did until now was very, very small in comparison to what's coming now. And there's an element of, we call it setting the heartbeat of the EU data spaces, that is keeping all of these sectors not necessarily perfectly aligned, but consistent among each other. Agriculture will have a different needs and different timeline than, say, automotive. Europe does not want to impose same deadlines or the same kind of speed of progress. It wants to keep everything organized and orchestrated, that's the best word, while recognizing the individual needs and requirements of data spaces. Cool. So almost there. I hope you're still with me. And again, I promise you will have the slides to read them comfortably offline. But let me throw at you 4 challenges I personally see for us for the next decade. And when I say us, it's not just me and my team. I'm talking to you as well, because wherever you are in the world, whether you are in the European Union or outside, most of these problems you will be experimenting yourselves, your legislators, you as a citizen, as a voter, as a citizen, you will need to be aware of what's coming. And the first one is this. Will legislators strike the best balance between fostering their country's economy and enabling the citizen sovereignty over data? So will we manage to find a way that ensures the rights of people and organizations on data, while at the same time not feeling like we are sacrificing the economy because we are too difficult, because we have too much legislation? Think about the resistance GDPR got in Europe in the early days. Was it really making things more complicated, or actually it was enabling the sovereignty of people? And this kind of perceived fake conflict is so misleading and is creating so much noise every time a new piece of legislation come out. Will our legislature be able to find that balance where we can both support the economy, but without sacrificing on the rights of people and organizations? And that's the point. So will we succeed also supporting citizens to develop the data literacy that is needed to exercise that sovereignty? If you do not understand what happens to your data, you will not be able to exercise your rights. If you don't know that you have the right to privacy, you will not protect your privacy. And none of what I described until now makes sense if the individuals are not active participants of the system as much as the companies. That's an interesting one for me specifically because I participate actively in consumer and industry association. That is, will consumer and industry association be effective enough and fast enough for their standards and rulebook to gain traction? You can't expect the legislator to come up with the standards you need to use. You cannot expect them to tell you how to do things. A lot of this information and guidance will come from private organizations and associations of industries. But it can be complicated. If we are part of GaiaX and others, you know how complex that is. We are often in the news more because we are slow than because we are effective. But the challenge of creating an agreement of how to work together and the standards for that is enormous. We need to be better. And finally, a bit on the lower level of the stack, more on the technology side, will emerging hyperscalers, cloud providers, be up to the challenge and enabled by legislation to provide services that can compete fairly with the tech giants? Everything I described depends heavily on a healthy market of cloud services. And we often, particularly the ones of us closer to the legislative side of things, we see the role and relevance of the traditional market players like the Amazon or the Microsoft of this world to be a difficult relationship to have. Will we ensure that the smaller players will still have a place? We will have a fighting chance to make the market healthy, or putting ourselves in a hole where without going too much detail here, where let's say the power dynamics are disproportionate, unbalanced. So I don't have the answer to these 4. I can just suggest that you work with me on finding the answers. I'm very, very happy to tell you more about all the topics I touched on today. It was a very, very dense half hour, and I'm very, very happy to answer your question in the next few minutes.
Thank you, Gianfranco, for this presentation. Very interesting to see what is going on at the European Union level. I will try now to switch on the microphones and the cameras for our participants so they can also ask their questions personally if they wish to. So this should be possible right now. So this is really now for everyone. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. There have been already a couple of questions in the chat. So I might just start with this, and then we can maybe take some live questions. I see Ronald has his hand up. Ronald, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Gianfranco, for this emerging us in what's happening new. It's that it's a lot of information, and I have to try to see how I can get my head around it. But could you give just some concrete example about what it will look like for a user, right? So what is the kind of also persona that you have in mind for this kind of work? And just to see what the services are that they will be using, right? So just the user perspective, and then those services, who is providing those services? Is that still done somewhere at EU level? And what are the providers of the data behind it? What is their role in keeping this these services going? So just some concrete example to make it more tangible for us, if you like.
Sure. I have a couple of them that we are working as experiments in France. I will not be able to tell you exactly which are the parties involved, but they are quite interesting and illustrative of what happens when you start sharing data in a control, but at the same time unleashing the potential of it. Something we are experimenting, for example, is say next generation journey planning and city planning. What happens to your city when you can start seamlessly integrating information, not only about the conventional, let's say, top to bottom sources like the weather, the transport network, traffic, perhaps from mobile operators that can observe as people move in the city, but also microscopic, very hyper-personal data like you and me's needs. I need to be fetching my child from school at this time in this point of the city, and then I need to go to the gym there. And imagine each of us feeling comfortable enough, because that's the first point there, to share that degree of detail about our personal lives to enable real-time deployment of, for example, public transport, real-time reallocation of resources to the networks, the services of the city, and so on. Sounds like science fiction almost, but in reality it's quite behind the corner, as long as we enable the organizations to work together effectively from both technological and legal point of view. Similar example, and possibly even more challenging because it may feel intrusive at the beginning. We were joking at the beginning of the call that I'm getting older, right? I'm 50. I am so old. And there are ways by which, by observing people's behavior, say how they use their mobile phone, how much internet they consume, how fast they are in changing channel on the TV, on their remote, you can spot in advance the degeneration of cognitive capabilities. Now you say, oh my God, this is the big brother observing me. Yes, but how better would your life be if you could be informed well in advance of your capabilities degenerating? If you could ensure that you're staying at home instead of being in a old people's house. If you could have the services enabling you to be autonomous very late in your life. All of this thanks to data you can share with providers of services and the government and the insurer that probably is responsible for taking care of you. So from an individual perspective, these kinds of new services is what we hope to get to a point where we are mature enough to provide. From a more corporate kind of perspective, the idea is really to taking down the barriers of traditional data sharing that you would only associate to supply chain. I need to help, to support, to share my data with the ones coming after me, and to get data from the company coming before me, because I need to keep this supply chain working. But all of those services I described actually come from taking down those barriers. The telco operator working with the transport operator, working with the public, with the municipality, working with the insurer, working with whatever. Yeah, I could talk for a very long time. I'm stop here. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah. Alex, if I can just link on to this. So what you're saying is that these are existing services provided by private sector or government that interact. Can I see it like that? So that they that you have Uber and your medical clinic being able to pick up some of that information to provide services to you and improve it. It's not that there is a new service, right? There is a new app that you load and that combines all of that. These are existing services that interact. Is that how to understand it? Yeah.
That's correct. My suggestion would actually be to stop thinking of it as a technology solution. It's more thinking of a collaboration solution. The parties working together, technology just being at the service of that. We have already good examples of integration, but we are limited by the way we are used to think in silos, right? So the collaboration is limited within the same industry or in very specific ad hoc agreements. So there will be new services, and most of them probably cannot even imagine. That kind of support to people living alone is something you couldn't even imagine until you accept the idea that data can be shared in a controlled way while keeping the individual sovereign on their rights. I'm not saying it's easy, by the way.
Thank you. I see two hands up. I missed the point where I think Jacob was first. Jacob, if you want to come in, I believe you're working for FAO, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Gianfranco. This was a really very interesting presentation. Mine is like, what can developing countries can learn from this type of experience, which is very critical problem in terms of data sharing. So, in my opinion, one of the critical challenge is like the behavioral change itself, of being openness for data. The technologies, the platform, all those things. I mean, you can really manage it, including the legislative. For some government to move to the legislative process, they have to believe that this openness has to exist. Therefore, it needs a kind of behavioral change in the decision makers from statistical offices or the government in general. So, in terms of that, what do you advise, to make this behavioral change happen in developing countries so that they really move towards that direction? That's one. The second point is specific to European experience, in particular for the upcoming project that you mentioned, the Data Space Support Center. Should we expect this would be going to address some openness for the microdata as well? Because I know there is some issues of accessing microdata still in the existing system from the European system as stands now. Therefore, should we expect something better in terms of accessing microdata from that system? Thank you very much.
So thank you for your question. To answer the first one, without making it sound too starry-eyed, I would take as an advantage the fact that you are following in a certain way. See the development of the mobile networks in the south of the world and how it made you mobile first. The Europe, let's say the ancient world, comes simply from a closed environment, simply because by culture it had to start from there. In many cultures that outside of Europe, for example, open or collaborating or the feeling of being a society in the interest of the collectivity are much stronger than perhaps a more individual society as Europe may be. Now, without being the sociologist of the situation, I'm not qualified for that. But really take a look at as an inspiration of how the mobile networks developed in the south of the world. And in the same way, open could be the default as you deal with the introduction of data sharing in your countries and legislation, because you don't need necessarily to be compatible or consistent with the old-fashioned way of doing things, exactly because you are a bit late, but not that much. On the again, I'm sorry if my wording is not fully politically correct. I hope you understand what I mean. I believe there is an advantage there. Already micro data and support center, data space support center. The ambition to be able to release the data of individuals, particularly for public causes, is very strong. Of the pieces of legislation you saw in my summary, the Data Act will include, for example, elements like the obligation for private organization to share data with government in case of emergencies. So the next epidemic or climate change. So, and if the data that is needed is personal, I believe that the new piece of legislation will give the rights to the countries in Europe to require some degree of sacrifice to your privacy in the name of the public good. Now, the text is in its very early days. Don't take me, don't quote me on that, but this is the general directions. There is some more awareness than ever of the individual responsibility we have in making our data available. It's not just about protection, it's also about unleashing it for the others. And again, we may argue for a very long time, think about the conversation related to fighting COVID-19 by sharing personal data of patients. Depending on the culture you belong to and your way of thinking, you may think it is a social responsibility. You may think it's a duty to share your personal data for that. I believe that the European Union legislators' ambition is that over time we get comfortable with the idea that we have a duty in sharing personal data if it is for a good application. The ambition for Data Space Support Center is to create a context where this will be technically safe, sound, and will give the comfort to citizens to do it in full comfort. Yeah. I repeat myself. So.
Thank you. Before I hand over to Christoph, who also raised his hand, may I just follow up maybe on this one? So the idea of the European Union is basically to oblige private citizens and companies to share the data. That is the idea, or will there be any system of incentives basically for the private people and the companies to do that? Because data is really the business model of many big companies, and I don't necessarily see why they want to share basically the basis for their business model, right?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The legislation is still evaluating incentives for private sector to share data with public. And by the way, as statistical offices, you should be very interested in that, because I believe it is a known trend that collecting data from businesses may be incredibly cheaper and more effective than the classic method of the guy with a clipboard surveying companies, right? So if it is in the interest of understanding the economy, for example, it may be acceptable to ask the companies to reveal, to sacrifice some of the data. And the degree whether to draw the line probably will be down to the final version of the legislation. But what is interesting here is the direction. It's going into the direction. Whether it is going to be mandatory or not, there is an awareness being developed that it is necessary, almost inevitable, if we want to deal with some of the problems we are dealing today, from the pandemic to climate change. It will be forcibly released also in emergency situation. I don't think there is any intention to negate the intellectual property of the companies and so on. This is done organically, and with time, I believe that the companies themselves will see the advantage of collaborating with government in releasing the data. Without going into too much detail, but you can follow the progress of the law. There is also the fair price, the fair compensation for revealing this data is being discussed in the legislation. So it's not necessarily for free, depending on the degree of emergency. The companies may be invited to collaborate, and also a fair price be defined for the data to be shared. But yeah, for statistical institutions, that will be, hopefully, will be a big tool for you to use.
Thanks for those clarifications and explanations. So now I would like to hand over to Christoph, who has his hand up. Christoph works in the Regional Commission for Asia and the Pacific, so please go ahead.
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation, and I'm following up the lead on what Alex just said about the incentive. And you almost pronounced the term market here, because it seems that from what I understood, you have there is a supply-based approach where all these partners try to adjust so that there is a big supply there, and there is demand. If there are some ways the movement so that there is be a demand-based approach, so that people say, we need that kind of data. That could be statistical offices, by the way. And then, of course, if there is a supply, at some point, there may be a price. So how do you see this will evolve in the next 10 years, for example, in terms of that?
Okay. Well, if you give me 10 years as a target, I can go wild, right? So I will sound a bit science fiction-y here, but ideally, each of us, even at an individual level, is a data provider. Which means whether it is a device or a person and so on, once we get with the right technology and the comfort coming from the legislation that we can share, you can imagine a relatively open market for data. And again, market used with carefully as a word, in which statistical institution, private organizations, rather than doing it, let's say, in a bit more subtle way, like I give you free email and you tell me how you behave on the internet, they will rather very directly say, I need this data from you. I can give you this in exchange, possibly even money, I don't know, and this data will be shared. You can also imagine emerging, and that's not news, the idea of data trusts as a model, where in the same way you have a financial advisor that manages your finances and your savings for you, you may have a data advisor that manages your data for you. And say, I don't have the time to decide who to give my data every day. I want to give it to cancer research. I don't want to give it to weapon research. But those data trusts will be able to represent your interests and scale appropriately so that each of us do not need to do that kind of decision every day. I hope we will develop that kind. It's a completely new sector if you think about it. Will you be able to name a data trust as a business? Probably not. I hope we will see those emerging soon, because we will need to develop some experience. Only the finance sector today is the closest possible to that model. I wish that we will have soon data trust, that we will literally be able to delegate our choices in terms of sharing data as individuals. But yeah, it will in controlled way. And again, at least within Europe, with the kind of legislation and governance you would expect from Europe, you can see a market for data coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Then there was a question in the chat from Anna Maria Scuderi. She said, so thank you for the examples, but how sustainable is such a kind of sharing of data if a government is not either social welfare oriented or developed enough to take care to such a level of service? Most of the least developed countries are not close to such sophistication. But so she wants to know how applicable such a model of businesses are in special situations, countries which are the focus of her work, like the least developed countries. Please go ahead.
So I can tell you what I've seen in Europe. That is 27 countries, not all of them, of course, with the same kind of budget for supporting the Open Data Program, but all of them over these many years have been developing constantly at different speeds and with different capabilities, but none of them, I would say, was out of the game. you're right. I mean, the capabilities and the budget change dramatically what you can afford doing, or how fast you can move to take advantage of the new ways of processing data. At the same time, with talent growing in our younger generations and technology probably being more accessible than ever in terms of cost and infrastructure, in the biggest obstacles to adoption, but that's a personal opinion, really feel just, oddly enough, culture. So if we fail on the data literacy element, I don't know why. I don't feel that worried about the cost of the technology here. I'm more worried about failing in helping my fellow citizens understand what's happening, understand their right, and exercising that opportunity to share data for at least for good applications. And if the tools, if the platforms for doing this are a bit more old-fashioned or old generations, I'm less worried. But I'm more worried that we, for example, don't use personal data for fighting climate change just because we are concerned or we don't know where the data goes, or we don't feel comfortable with the legislative system of our country. That worries me more than the cost of it. Sometimes even small applications and small initiatives can deliver significant impact from what I've seen over the last few years.
Thank you. We're already a little bit late, but I would like to take one final question by Tanya Seljersen. She works also in the Economic Regional Commission for Asia and the Pacific. So she's asking, so this is super interesting. I'm wondering which role the national statistical offices in Europe have played in these developments. Please go ahead.
So the statistical offices are the natural data space for the understanding of your own country. So today you are already in a way behaving in that way, on a more centralized way perhaps. So you run original research, you collect data, again with the classic person with a clipboard running surveys. But I believe many of the statistical institutions worldwide, not just in Europe, are already using more modern ways to gather intelligence on the status of the economy or the society of your countries. The move towards a more mature legislation and all of those efforts and initiatives I described to get organizations and individuals to share data should enable the national statistical offices to continue in performing that kind of trusted observer of your country, using more tools and channels that you have had before. I believe that also statistical institutions have a privilege that is, in most countries, I believe, you benefit of a great reputation. You may be sometimes see as the serious statisticians, right? But nobody would argue of the rigor and the robustness of what you do, which makes you incredibly credible. You would say that if we needed to start trusting someone in government to share our data with, I would probably start from sharing my data with the official statistical institution. So use that, please. We need that.
Thanks. I see Ronald has his hand up, so I'll hand over to Ronald maybe for closing remarks, and then we have to wrap up, I guess.
Yeah, maybe one more question. I will give Gianfranco the possibility to close. Gianfranco, you made this comparison with the financial world. So you could see data as also a flow of financial assets, which are mostly encrypted, right? Could you see that encryption of data applied in a useful way makes it easier to share your data, right? So it's always a little frightening that if you just put your data all in the open and everybody gets access to it, but if it is encrypted and it's just used for the services which you like them to be used for, is that something for the future? How do you see that? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Well, in a way, I believe you're giving me a segue to promote the privacy and anti-technology work that you are doing. and many of us are actually focused on, that is, there exist privacy-enhancing technologies that are good enough and have decades already of history, by the way. It sounds like they're new stuff, but they have been around for decades. If you look at the academic papers that enable, for example, to do calculations on encrypted data without unencrypting it. They're allowed to do calculations on distributed sources of data without bringing them in the same place. That is an integral element of the data space that does not need a centralized element to it. So I'm running literally a workshop at My Data in Helsinki, the My Data conference, on PETs on the 22nd. And so if the idea is we can, on the side of legislation, that you heard me before, I bang a lot about this, we need to get the legislation right and people feel comfortable their sovereignty is protected. A lot of that guarantees for safety come from modern technology being used to use encryption as much as possible, and not necessarily just to hide stuff, but also to ensure integrity. We talk less about integrity, right? I'm not a big blockchain fanboy, but the whole point about the blockchain is about integrity before hiding. It is about ensuring that nobody individually can hijack a content of a ledger. And that's another important element of publishing. What would happen if someone sabotaged a national statistical institution and started publishing wrong economic data? There are technologies that today enable you to protect significantly this stuff without even necessarily being extremely expensive. And now I'm not saying that I don't know, the UN Statistical Office should move to the blockchain because there's no need of conventional data portals anymore. But you know, the right tools for the right job, right? And we are mature enough, I believe, to make good choices or to experiment with the new stuff in a controlled environment to move towards the direction, including PET. Not always the best, not always the most cost-effective, but no justification not to even try.
Thank you. So now we have to wrap up. Sorry for this, but I would like to encourage everyone now to unmute themselves and also switch on the camera if you wish, and give Gianfranco a big round of applause for his great presentation and his insights. Thank you. Thank you. It's not quite the same as in a big meeting room full of people, but we're still working on it. So thanks everyone for joining today. If not all questions have been answered, we will try together with Gianfranco to answer them on the global network after the event, once we have posted also the recording of the event and the slides there. If you are not yet a member of the global network of data officers and statisticians, please join. The link is in the chat, and see you next time for our next Global Network webinar. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye, ciao.
Thank you.